Hi, everybody. I thought I'd play us in with some Lauryn Hill. I'm a massive, massive fan of Lauryn. I love that song. It's just like a song of a revolution for me. And in the work that we're doing with regards to Pan-African consciousness and challenging racism, the white supremacist system, you need some revolutionary music. So I hope everybody is well. So today's show, what I'm going to be doing is it's Black History Month here in the UK. So I'm going to be talking about somebody who made a massive difference with regards to developing Black consciousness, finance, economics. And one of the things that we consistently talk about in some of the groups that I'm part of is developing an economic infrastructure that sits outside of the white supremacist one. And there is also the argument that if we don't do that as a people, we will never achieve what we're wanting to with regards to eradicating the white supremacist system. So today's presentation is going to focus on a man known as Tafari Makonnen, or Tafari Ras Makonnen, who changed his name. So I'm just going to go into share screen, choose my application, and here we go. So moving back to this screen and putting it onto large. You know, it's just me, peeps, so please give me a moment. Play from start. Okay. So a couple of pointers. In the UK, our Black History Month is in October, and that began in the 1980s in the UK. Now, I know in the US, they have theirs in February, and that began in the 1920s. So we were sort of 60 years behind with regards to a Black History Month in the UK. And Black History Month is about celebrating, recognizing, promoting the achievements and contributions of people of African origin to the world. What I would say is Black History Month for me is always a double-edged sword. So it's a bit of sweet and sour, because if we had made the progress that in particular sort of the British state, the government likes to consistently say that we have with regards to race and racial equality, we wouldn't have a need for a Black History Month, because that teaching and that knowledge would be shared across our mainstream education system, as well as our informal education system, that being media and socialization. And we're not there yet. That's why we still have a month for Black history. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I do work around Black history and pre and post-colonial African teaching all year round. So this is not a one-off for me at all. But it's a pleasure to be able to share it with the GPAN, Global Pan-African Network. And just that reminder that Black history is our history, lessons to grow on. So I think it's important for us to recognize as Black people, as people of African origin, that we have been educated widely within a white supremacist created system. So it requires the onus, the responsibility falls on us to unlearn and relearn what we've been taught through that system. And I think one of the ways that we do that is by following the examples of African people, Black people who came before us. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. To read, reading is crucial, and we'll see that as we go through this presentation. So Pan-African ethos in business. So here are some of the greats who spoke about the need for us having a Pan-African ethos when it comes to economics and our business. And I think that's one of the things, it seems like a huge task, and it can be really daunting when you consider how do we support each other better? How do we develop and support African led businesses, whether they're on the continent or in the diaspora? So Kwame Nkrumah talked about it, Walter Rodney talked about it, consistently speak about the need for the African population to develop an economic infrastructure. And there's a lot of reference about ownership. And I think that comes from colonialism, when ownership of the land was taken from African people on the continent, and then fell into the hands of European colonizers, later North American ones. Also, the need to own means of production. I'll be talking about this as we go through. So the impact of colonialism and neo-colonialism has massive implications for how we do this going forward. Walter Rodney, this book, I think, really got me thinking. If you haven't read this book, I would recommend that you do, because it really got me thinking, how do we go about developing an economic infrastructure that is African-led, that is Black-led? Obviously, the way that the world is set up, there's global trade, so there would be a requirement to trade with other nations, other countries who are not part of the African continent. But I think it's really important that African people are going to be in charge of how those partnerships, those business partnerships develop. So how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Quote from the book: "This book delves into the past only because otherwise it would be impossible to understand how the present came into being and what the trends are for the near future." Again, another quote from the book: "Colonialism's essential purpose was to repatriate the profits to the so-called mother country." So colonialism has had a huge impact on the economic development of the African continent. And it continues to actually have a huge impact on the economic development of Black people in the diaspora. But if we focus on colonialism on the continent, this is how it works. And I got all of this learning from this book. So colonizing countries, and as we know, colonialism was driven by capitalism. So colonizing countries and the capitalist companies within them, they were able to gain access to cheap African land and labor due to colonialism, due to the violence that was used to take that land, due to the manipulation and the insidious deals that were done to get access to African land. And then access to, at one time, free labor due to racialized slavery, and then excessively cheap labor. When independence happened for so many African countries, these capitalist companies that came from the colonizing countries did not just simply leave the continent because of the resources there. There was no way that they were going to do that. And the reason why independence was granted in a lot of cases is because those colonizing countries, combined with the capitalist companies, had set up systems of dependence. So by this point, the companies had created this system where African people relied on them for wages, even though these wages were considerably less than their European counterparts. So if we take the case of African miners, they were paid considerably less than what, for example, Scottish miners were being paid. So both jobs were tough, but I think what I read in the book is that a Scottish miner could earn in a day the same as what an African miner was earning for a 6-day week. So that was the difference in terms of wage. The way that it worked for the capitalist companies, where African workers were used to gather the raw resources for those companies, they needed to then turn those raw resources into sellable products. Now, the way that these companies ensured that the means of production stayed with the capitalist companies, therefore with the former colonizing countries, is that they hired non-African people to oversee their factories that were on the continent. And in other cases, they created laboratories, and this is quite specific to Unilever, which is a massive, massive global company now. They created laboratories outside of the continent, which meant that the knowledge of how you turn a raw resource into a profitable, sellable product was withheld from people on the African continent. And that ensured that the profit and the knowledge would always remain with those former colonizing countries. The profits that colonizing countries gained ensured that they were then able to develop better technology, such as refrigerated ships, which then increased their profits for them. And again, none of that knowledge was shared back to African workers and to African people. Now, I fully recognize that on the continent, we have African scientists, technology whizzes, all of these things. But overall, access to that technology is still retained by the colonizing countries. And if people want to have access to that technology, they have to pay what that former colonizing country is demanding. Next is the colonizing countries were able to set the import and export rates, meaning that they set the prices that they would buy a crop, for example. They would set the price that they would buy that crop for. They would also then set the price for the imported tools that the farmer would need to produce a crop. and they still, to a degree, withhold technology that produced a greater yield of the crop. And that ensured that the profit for them continued to grow, but not for the farmer, because he or she was paying more for the imported tools than what they were selling their crop for. So it's a very integrated system, economic system, that always worked out in favor of the former colonizing countries. And to a degree, this system still remains in place within certain African countries. So now we're moving into the main man himself, Tafari Ras Makonnen, or as I've said, Ras T. Makonnen. He was born in Guyana in 1909. Now, I have put this map on because I always assume when I go into a teaching session, I'm always ready to learn from somebody who might tell me something that I don't know. And I recognize that not everybody knows where every country in the world is. So I put these images on so people have an understanding of where Guyana is, its relevance to North America, the Caribbean, and Europe. So this is where he was born in 1909. His birth name was George Thomas Griffiths, but he changed his name after the second attempt by Italy to colonize Ethiopia. And his paternal grandfather was born in Ethiopia. So I think it was out of respect and recognition of his African heritage that he changed his name to Ras T. Makonnen. After completing secondary school in Guyana, he moved to Texas to study mineralogy. And that's where he began to get really involved with activism, challenging the white supremacist system, particularly those systems which created high rent for Black people living in the States, high rent in low economic, poorly deprived areas. And he began challenging that. And this is an image of him. It was one of the best images I can find. I know it's a little bit grainy. This is why I keep coming back to the importance of reading. Ras Makonnen was a great reader and with a particular interest in books on British imperialism. So what he was doing was effectively developing his knowledge about how the African continent, African people on the continent and in the diaspora were living in the circumstances they were living in, as in being at the bottom of a socioeconomic hierarchy. So he developed that knowledge and was able to turn that knowledge into power. And we're going to look at that as we go through. In 1935, he moved from the US to Europe. He had a brief stay in London. While he was there, he spoke on a panel with author and historian C.L.R. James, who wrote The Black Jacobins, which was about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, and Jomo Kenyatta, and he was later to become president of Kenya. So he connected to some very powerful people, all of them from different places in the African diaspora, yet they came together for one goal, one cause. And I think that one of the things that I admire so much about Ras T. Makonnen was his emphasis on unity. It didn't matter where you were born, what language you spoke, the importance was on unity and recognizing that as one, we must come together to dismantle the white supremacist system. After his brief stay in London, he moved to Denmark to study, but he was actually deported because he suggested that the mustard sold by Denmark was being used in mustard attacks against Ethiopians by the Italians. And we see these links within white supremacy. So, for example, Angela Davis talked about the fact that troops in Israel have received training from the US militia, and in turn, arms exchanges has happened. So we see these links within white supremacy, and Ras Makonnen identified that way before we had the internet because of his reading, his knowledge, and his connections to people on the African continent and in the diaspora. And I think that's something that we should all really be aspiring to. He finally moved to London after his deportation from Denmark in 1937. And that's where he joined the International African Service Bureau, which was existed in the UK at that time. And he was their business manager. So he already had a good idea of business and how to make money. The IASB stood for the progress and social advancement of Africans at home and abroad. They wanted full economic, political, and racial equality and self-determination. Now, when I think about Pan-African teaching, it hasn't moved away from this. I think that certain things have happened. There's been splintering within the African diaspora and on the continent, which is not an accidental thing. There's been puppet leaders in charge of African countries, corruption, which causes splintering. But overall, as a people, for those of us who want to see these changes, this still remains at the heart of Pan-African revolution, Pan-African practice. So after the start of World War II in the UK, Makonnen then moved to Manchester. He studied at Manchester University, but he also opened 4 restaurants and a nightclub. His businesses became massively successful because Ras Makonnen understood white supremacy, and he understood that white supremacy was concerned with capitalism, but it also had to ensure that blatant racism existed on the ground. And this was happening in the UK. It meant that African-American soldiers who moved to the UK during World War II were refused service often. And Ras Makonnen saw the gap in the market and then set up restaurants and a nightclub. So in the UK, and I don't know whether a lot of people know this, if you're not aware sort of UK history and Black history in the UK, Britain did not adopt a Jim Crow legislation that there was in the US. However, we did have an unofficial colour bar, which meant it was legal for restaurants and shops to refuse to serve Black people. And this was what was happening pre-World War II and after. So that it was not uncommon for bed and breakfasts to have signs like this in the window: no Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. And these signs were not deemed illegal. And moving down here, you can see some other signs to let, to furnish. So this is to get access to accommodation. And then it says here, sorry, no coloureds. And again here, sorry, no coloureds. This was perfectly legal in the UK at the time. Makonnen's businesses met the needs of the Black community. And because he did so well with his restaurants and nightclubs, he was then able to buy property, which he let to Black people. And he let those properties to Black people in recognition of what they were facing when it came to getting access to decent property in the UK. And I love the fact that with the profits, he invested back into the Black community. And by doing that, he was challenging the white supremacist system, as well as endorsing a Pan-African ethos in business. Makonnen also lent money to potential Black entrepreneurs to open their own businesses. So he reinvested back into the Black community. His terms were fair, but he was still business minded. And I think this is important. It's got to be recognized that we do need to be conscious about profit and where that money is going, and not just giving away handouts. There's got to be responsibility and onus on the individual whose money is being lent to. So for example, there was a man, I believe his name was George Williams, who approached Makonnen and asked for money to buy a nightclub in Liverpool. And Makonnen said to him, these are going to be the terms. I will loan you the money. It will be £40 a month interest for 3 months. If you don't pay it back within 3 months, I will become part owner of the business. And that was the deal that was made. George Williams was able to repay the loan within 3 months. So he got his business, and Makonnen made some profit, which he then invested back into the Black community. So it's not about handouts. He also ensured jobs for Black people in his business ventures. So he ensured that Jomo Kenyatta, and this is him here, was employed in the UK before he returned to Kenya to become president. So this is how you do for self and then do for your people. I love this story. This is one of my, I just love this story about what Makonnen did. He also used his resources to provide legal and political support for the Black community, again in recognition of how he could use his business acumen to dismantle the white supremacist system that was determined to denigrate and keep Black people down and at the bottom of a socioeconomic hierarchy. So on one occasion, he raised the funds to defend 120 Black seamen in the UK who were charged with mutiny. And he famously paid for the legal defense of Donald Gerald Newton Beard. So Beard was a Jamaican man in the RAF, and he was charged with murder. So Makonnen brought over the renowned Jamaican barrister Norman Manley. Manley destroyed the case. So what I love about this is that Makonnen recognized that we have the skills and the ability within our own community, within our own people, to challenge the white supremacist system, and that we should be working with each other and paying each other in that work, as well as developing our own economic infrastructure. So what Manley did is he came and he recognised the issue of racism within the police in the UK. So 2 police officers had said that Beard was the perpetrator. He did commit murder because they had seen him from 40 yards away, so they were able to effectively identify him. Manley not only embarrassed the police by showing them images of black men and clearly being able to discern that these police officers were incapable of distinguishing the difference between one black person and another. And this is something that we still see within the criminal justice system, not just in the UK, but in the US, in Western Europe, globally. But he also found out that there had been heavy snowfall on the night of the murder. And he brought in people who were able to state that on that night, visibility was no more than 10 yards. And the judge had to stop the case and all the charges were dropped. So using black economics, Makonnen was able to bring over Norman to be able to challenge the white system. One of I think most monumental to UK and in the world is he was one of the funders of the 5th Pan-African Conference. And this conference is called one of the most important ones. And it was held in Manchester in this building in 1945 at the end of World War II. It's important to recognize that Makonnen and his colleagues, who are all Pan-African thinkers, recognized that in that war, soldiers from the colonies were brought in to fight, but they were still subjected to racist abuse. So in Parliament at the time, during World War II, Churchill's cabinet agreed that black soldiers from the Caribbean and from the continent could not fight white soldiers on European soil, even if that would have ensured victory. Because if those black soldiers had beaten European soldiers, even though those soldiers were Nazis, if those black soldiers had beaten them, it would destroy the concept of race. And we know that the concept of race is built on the myth of natural white superiority. So out of fear of that concept being destroyed, and it's not just that concept, it's all the profit, the capital gains from the concept of race, they ensured that black soldiers did not fight white soldiers on European soil. Black soldiers were not given medals of honor and they were banned from marching in victory parades. This was not lost at all on Makonnen and his Pan-African colleagues. So at the end of World War II, we had some 700 million people around the world living under imperial rule of Western Europe and increasingly North America. These people had no freedoms. They had no parliaments, no democracy, no trade unions to protect workers, which allowed the colonizing nations to continue to exploit and make profit from black people, from black land, from African land. Unlike the 4 earlier Pan-African Congresses, the 5th one really was about bringing us together as one, unity. It involved people from the African diaspora, so not just African people born on the continent, but African Caribbeans, African Americans, African people living in Britain. So it was really about unity and using all of our collective skills, knowledge, and abilities to demand change. Some of the famous attendees at the 5th Pan-African Congress included Du Bois, Jomo Kenyatta, Hastings Banda, who was later to become the leader of Malawi, Kwame Nkrumah, Dudley Thompson, who was from Jamaica, and Amy Garvey, who was an activist and the wife of Marcus Garvey. And this is a photograph of some of the attendees. Again, very grainy. I'd really love it if somebody restored these photographs so that we could see the people clearly, because these are the shoulders that we stand on today. So these were the key issues that were discussed at the the 5th Pan-African Congress. One was about the colour problem in Britain. This was actually a term that was used by many politicians as well, but in a negative sense, meaning that the more Black people that were coming into Britain, the more problem that we have, as opposed to the more we have to recognise how racist our society is. So there was discussion around unemployment amongst Black young people, abandoned Black mixed children. I'd like to make a point here, because I've done a great deal of research about what were called the brown babies. There was a lot of pressure put onto white mothers who had had a child with a Black serviceman to give their children up to the state. And that pressure was actually put on by the state. And Churchill himself asked to be kept informed of the numbers of brown babies being born in the UK. His fear was that these children were essentially British and couldn't be deported or removed. And that was his concern. We are going to have an increase of a Black British population, and that was a problem, living on British soil, and that was a problem. So there was a lot of pressure put onto white mothers of Black mixed children. Racial discrimination was discussed, the colour bar and discriminatory employment practices. Also, I think what's key for me is all of these things are still relevant to varying degrees, particularly within Pan-African discussion, Pan-African groups. So imperialism in North and West Africa, all present demanded independence for African nations. Excuse me. Oppression in South Africa, legal apartheid. I know that apartheid is still an issue in South Africa, but legal apartheid still existed at the time. So that included the social, economic, educational, health and employment inequalities faced by Black South Africans. The East African picture, focusing on the issue of land. Most of the best land had been occupied by white settlers. Working conditions and wages for Africans reflected the same inequalities as South Africa. This is still an issue. Ethiopia and the Black republics, which is discussing the issue of Britain exercising control over Ethiopia via sanctions, economic sanctions, and then the problems in the Caribbean. This session was addressed by a number of trade union delegates from the Caribbean. Some delegates demanded complete independence and others dominion status. So these were the things that were discussed at length, and resolutions were proposed. And these were some of the demands. Pan-Africanism is aimed at the economic, intellectual and political cooperation of the African countries. This still needs to happen. It demands that the riches of the continent be used for the enlistment of its people. This still needs to happen. It calls for the financial and economic unification of markets and a new political landscape for the continent. This still needs to happen. What I love about this, and what sort of at the same time, I suppose a little bit depressing about this, is that all of this was identified in 1945. And yet as a people, we haven't made enough progress. I absolutely recognize the system of white supremacy deliberately tries to place a barrier to us achieving this. But I think that we must not lose sight of the aims. We have to recognize that, of course, there will be some people, Black people, people of African origin, who are happy to work for the white supremacist system for individual gain. They're not our concern. What we should be focusing on, those who want to unify and work with us to achieve these aims. How do we do that? How do we come together more effectively? And GPAN, Global Pan-African Network, is about working towards these aims. So even though Pan-Africanism as a movement began in 1776, it was the 5th Pan-African Congress, which Makonnen funded, that advanced Pan-Africanism and applied it to decolonize the African continent. And this was a book that was written by Ras Makonnen. Okay, I'm going to reduce that. I have a very, very quick video, if I can find it, which gives a little bit of a breakdown about what was achieved by those people who attended the Pan-African Congress of 1945. I'm going to bring it slightly forward, pause it for a moment while I bring in that effective screen share. I just think it's really important to recognize that it wasn't that the Congress just took place. Bringing it back to share screen, application window. there was change brought from this Congress. There was real change. And I think that we need to be able to celebrate and recognize the impact that Congress had, and that impact was influenced by the development of an economic infrastructure led by Ras Makonnen. So here is that video.
One of the key problems, and it came out in the fifth Pan-African Congress, that we had to rediscover ourselves, find out who we are, what we are, and not who we are told we are. It wasn't until then, that Pan-African Congress, that I saw the way ahead clearly and knew one day all of Africa would be free.
The Congress is the dress rehearsal, or the forum in which the leaders of post-colonial Africa make their debut.
Kwame Nkrumah, who went on to become the president of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta, who became the leader of Kenya, Hastings Landa, who headed an independent Malawi after Sudan became independent.
Dr. Nkrumah went out his way to make it into what it is today. He endeavored continually to bring us freedom and liberty to Ghana. Ghana is the name, Ghana we wish to proclaim. We will be jolly, merry and gay.
The most striking of all the impressions that I have formed since I left London a month ago is of the strength of this African national consciousness.
When do you want independence for Kenya?
Today.
How soon do you foresee independence in North Rhodesia?
Things are moving so fast in Africa that anything between 1 and 2 years.
The issue is politics, not social or economic.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it as a fact. Our national policies must take account of it.
That was a very, very short clip. I'm going to just put myself back on here. That was a very, very short clip. But I think all of the people that you saw at the end there, you can see the full title here if you wanted to catch this on YouTube. All of the people that you saw there all attended the 5th Pan-African Congress, which Makonnen funded in 1945 in Manchester, bringing together people of African origin from the diaspora and the continent to learn from each other, to share knowledge, to discuss how a successful independence could happen on the continent, what that would mean, what that would look like, what would work best for the people, and how we can be doing that in the diaspora as well. And look at what some of those people went on to do. And I think that that's the importance of coming together as a people to have discussion, because it can really produce change, even if it's in you as an individual, to give you that confidence or that knowledge or that self-belief that you can make those differences. And I know that for me personally, in the work that I do, I spend a lot of time in education. I work with young people of all backgrounds, but I have a belief that education can really make a difference when it comes to dismantling the white supremacist system. I've spent a great deal of time educating myself on the reality of colorism and what it means when someone of my complexion gets up on a platform, and the fact that I can be offered platforms that a darker skinned person wouldn't. But it's important for me to then use that platform to push a Pan-African ethos and to show that I am one, I'm unified with my African brothers and sisters. I have one last slide and then come back to me. My presentation is finished. I'll have a quick look at the comments. Yes, it's this one. And the reason why I've put this up is because I feel very strongly about it. What I've seen on social media in the last couple of days has absolutely horrified me. What is happening in Nigeria with regards to, I don't even like to use the term special anti-robbery service because it's clearly obvious that that is not what they are. I have seen torture, abuse. I didn't want to share any of those videos because I feel that as a people, we are daily subjected to images of violence against Black people, death. It's becoming normalized. It's becoming increasingly normalized, and it hurts. It's traumatic. It has an impact on the psyche. But for me personally, this hashtag is trending, hashtag EndSARS, and I stand with that. And I stand with the people of Nigeria who are putting their lives and their personal safety on the line to stand up against what the Nigerian government is endorsing with regards to SARS. And I wanted to say that at the end of this presentation, because I've been deeply moved. And I had a person who is from Nigeria who tagged me in something. I don't know this person personally. And they said, I would just hope that you can retweet. The Western world needs to know what's happening. And when he said the Western world, he was referring to those of us of African origin who are living in the diaspora to support this cause. They're not looking for white saviors. They want us to stand with them, and we should be. So that's why I've put that up. It's very important to me because I was horrified at what I saw. So that's been my presentation today. So with regards to, I'm just looking at some of the comments, and people are saying, how do we access this? I will write the YouTube link into the chat so that people can then watch it back and share it and so on and so forth. It's beautiful to share information amongst ourselves. I think that it does make a difference. Like I said, I'm always learning. That's what I feel that I'm going to be doing for the rest of our life. Is I will always be learning and growing and developing and using that learning to dismantle the white supremacist system, to work towards as much as possible unity amongst people of African origin, whether it be in the diaspora, in the continent, connecting with businesses on the continent. And I think that what I would really like to see going forward is more Pan-African congresses where people can come together, recognize the strength within themselves, our strength as a people, and then take that back to wherever they're from, wherever they live, keep those networks. We have the internet now. Back in 1945, they didn't have this sort of instant access that we all have, that we are kind of privileged to have now. So we should really be in a better place to progress what they had already laid down, those foundations that they had laid down. And instead, what I'm seeing is that there is increased distraction. I'm actually seeing an increase in people of African origin playing into what white supremacy tells them that they are. So for example, you can become famous, if you will, and famous is important. And that's what we're taught, to be famous is important for twerking. Now, do you know when I say this, people sort of go, oh, you're hating on I can't twerk. I know this, I can't twerk. I do recognize it is a skill. But that is not all that our African sisters are capable of doing. That's not all, that's not the totality of us. In the same way that we are taught that that Black males can be successful if they're rapping about killing other Black men. We should be working against that teaching. And the only way that we can do that is to unlearn and relearn. So, oh yeah, I'm just going to put that one on. He absolutely is. And you know, when I was doing research for him, a lot of people call him the unsung hero because a lot of people don't know of him, which is, I suppose, a testament to him because he didn't care about being famous. He cared about making a difference. And he did that predominantly through understanding economics and how to reinvest back into the Black community. And some of the work that I'm doing now, that's one of the things that we're really talking about is locally, how we can support Black business, Black entrepreneurs, what teaching, what skills we have amongst ourselves to be able to offer that teaching and that knowledge so that those businesses can take off and to ensure that we do support. And we had a big discussion. There was one young man, he made a valid point. He said that the cost of products in Black-owned businesses tends to be higher than if, for example, you went to an Asian-owned shop. So we did have a big discussion about if we began buying there more, then the unit price would come down because they would be able to be buying on bulk. So it was about developing that understanding. And then he understood that, and he recognized that for that sort of sacrifice at the moment, money is tight for people, I appreciate that. But for that sacrifice of paying an extra, say, £2 or £3 for the product, eventually that could become a flourishing business where the unit price would come down. So I would say that for people, if you have access to networks where people have set up successful businesses, to then ask them to provide training about how they did that, how they set up, how they registered with the right bodies, how they got staff on payroll, who they use for their payroll. Do we have Black accountants? We know that we do. So how can we use that more effectively? And we've done that locally. We really have done that locally and tried to make a difference in that way. So I am going to write, if people stay on, I am going to write the YouTube link in the chat. I thought I had done that, but I hadn't. And I'm going to play us out with some absolute love. I used to do a radio show. I preferred radio because then I didn't have to get ready. But I used to do a radio show, and I always love using music as part of my message. And music is very powerful. And I'm actually going to be doing some work next week with a school about how music can be used to challenge racism. So I always like to use music, and I am going to play us out with some Chronixx, because Chronixx, whether he knows it or not, he's my soul husband. So please stay on this chat. Enjoy Chronixx as I play out with Chronixx. And it won't be me next week. Hosting racism and African heritage. Oh, my last point, because I always forget these things. At the moment, going across the bottom of the screen, sign up for African Business Month. It's being led by GPAM, and that's all the information that you need to know there. If you have a business and wanting to set up a business, sign up to that. You'll get learning, and it works very well with the talk that I've just done about Makonnen, because it is a way of us developing our own economic infrastructure. So until I see you next time, please stay on the chat if you want the YouTube link. Much love and light, people. Absolutely love Chronixx. Okay, everybody, take care. Look after yourselves. Much love and blessings. See you another time on race, racism, and African heritage. Bye.